Good afternoon. It's great to see all of you here today. I'm Joseph Honor, Associate Provost. On behalf of Provost Robert McGrath, I'm delighted to welcome you here to this special Provost Lecture in conjunction with the annual George Goodman Symposium. 7 years ago, the Goodman Symposium was established by the Goodman family to honor the memory of George Goodman, who was a faculty member in the Department of Ophthalmology in the medical school. Dr. Goodman was the founding member of Physicians for Social Responsibility. He inspired many, including his distinguished children, Amy and David, to social participation. The Goodman Symposium has become an important addition to the intellectual life of Stony Brook University and the surrounding community. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to bring Amy Goodman up on the stage to say a few words of welcome.
Well, it's a great honor to be with you all today and to celebrate not only my dad, George Goodman, who was committed with my mother, Dory Goodman, and I believe all the people at the round table at Stony Brook here, to the idea of lifelong learning. This honors the round table here at Stony Brook, like organizations around the country, continuing education throughout our lives. It's absolutely essential. It's interesting, I see the round table as a model for Democracy Now!, the daily TV and radio show that we do in New York that has just recently gone on WUSB 90.1 FM every day from 5 to 6 in the afternoon. And of course on WBAI and other stations. But it is an expansion of that round table where we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day, like my dad did with some of you here at Stony Brook running the current events round table. There is nothing more noble than being involved, than participating, than being engaged. It truly is a matter of life and death now. It truly is essential for all of us to talk about issues of war and peace. So tonight and this afternoon, it's wonderful to be here with our two speakers, with Phil Donahue, who all of you, of course, know, a great first talk show host, humanitarian, who most recently was on MSNBC right before the invasion. And though he had the most popular program on that network, ultimately, the program was canceled right before the invasion. Later, a secret NBC memo came out that said that on the eve of the invasion, they didn't want a forum that had this kind of anti-war face when the other networks were waving the American flag. Well, I think, in fact, there can be nothing more patriotic than simply asking the kinds of questions that Phil Donahue was doing, bringing on people of every political stripe to actually debate the issues that would determine the fate of young and old in this country being sent to war. And then, of course, Michael Ratner, who, as president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, has devoted his life to issues of peace and justice. And we'll be talking about something that I think horrifies many. Most people in this country don't even realize what the issue of torture is for people around the world, how our country has unfortunately become synonymous with it. But I deeply believe the more we know, the more we can do something about it. So thanks all for coming out. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Amy. So we are really deeply honored to have with us today Phil Donahue and Michael Ratner, who will be speaking on the very timely issue of terrorism and dissent. Michael Ratner is president of the Center for Constitutional Rights, a nonprofit human rights litigation organization in New York City. He also serves as adjunct professor at Columbia Law School, where he teaches international human rights litigation, and is lecturer at Yale Law School. He was co-counsel in representing the Guantanamo detainees in the Supreme Court, where a major victory was won in June 2004. He and his office have sued 2 of the private contractors in Iraq, alleging their employees were involved in the abuses and torture at Abu Ghraib. He recently filed a criminal complaint in the courts of Germany against Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and other U.S. officials seeking the initiation of criminal prosecutions against them for the Abu Ghraib abuse and torture. Mr. Ratner has written extensively on the Patriot Act, military tribunals, and civil liberties in the post-9/11 world. He has also been involved in opposing the Iraq War and co-authored the book Against the War in Iraq. His most recent book is Guantanamo, What the World Should Know. Other writings on the current situation include chapters in Freedom at Risk, It's a Free Country, Lost Liberties, and many other books. His legal texts include international human rights litigation in U.S. courts from 1996. Phil Donahue has been a major force in television for 3 decades, conducting interviews with many world leaders, celebrities, and newsmakers from around the world and from all walks of life. The Phil Donahue Show, which was introduced in 1967, was the first audience participation television talk show. Its over 7,000 broadcasts changed the face of American daytime television and helped expand the role of television in all aspects of political and social life. No doubt there are many people in this audience today whose lives have been significantly touched by his work. His many honors include his induction in 1993 to the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Hall of Fame, 20 Emmy Awards for The Phil Donahue Show, a George Foster Peabody Journalism Award, a President's Award from the National Women's Political Caucus, and the first Media Person in the Year from the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation. In addition to The Donahue Show, he has hosted many special broadcasts for local and network television and PBS. He's moderated presidential debates, and he organized joint telecasts in 1985 and 86 between the U.S. and Soviet Union. I remember those well. Mr. Donahue is also a frequent contributor to newspaper editorial pages, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and Newsday. Following the lecture, we'll have presentations by Mr. Ratner and Mr. Donahue, and then there'll be time for questions. And at the end, I'll ask you to line up at those 2 microphones there, and then we'll take turns at the 2 microphones. Following that, we have a nice reception here that is generally hosted by Mrs. Dory Goodman. And I'd like to extend my personal thanks to the Roundtable for being a part of this, and to Dory in particular for all her efforts in making this event possible. So maybe a hand for Dory Goodman, if you don't mind. And last but not least, please turn off your cell phones. And now please join me in welcoming Michael Ratner and Phil Donahue.
Thank you very much for being here and inviting me. I have a long relationship with the Goodman family, with Amy, with David. Amy puts me on her program all the time, probably because I live around the corner from the station. David actually took a picture of me and a co-counsel when we served General Gramajo for human rights violations in Guatemala, and the picture appeared on the front page of the Boston Globe the day he was getting his graduation degree from the Kennedy School. So I have a long relationship. I like the Goodman family a lot. I knew George Goodman. He would preside at our progressive Passovers. And I also remember Amy's 40th birthday, if you think she's that old. But at Amy's 40th birthday, he was there. And I remember his favorite music was, some of my favorite music was the music of Yip Harburg. And I hope most of you know who that is. He wrote Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Lyrics to Wizard of Oz, lots of other things, but a progressive voice that is sorely, sorely needed right now. I'm also honored to be here with Phil Donahue. Phil, he's a hero of mine in part because he once put me on one of his TV programs with Susan Sarandon. And it was a nice chance to meet Susan, but it actually, the program is interesting because it again shows Phil's incredible courage and strength. It was 91 or 92, I think, and I was litigating the rights of Haitian refugees at the Guantanamo Bay prison camp in Guantanamo, and they were the HIV refugees, and no one in the country was really covering it. And then all of a sudden, there's Phil Donahue. Susan was active on the issue, putting me on the program with Susan. Again, pioneering journalism, that makes a real difference. And of course, as Amy has mentioned, the recent dust-up over the war, and when the MSNBC, despite his show being among the most, if not the most popular, after he put on I think it's called the Mothers for a Peaceful Tomorrow, Harry Belafonte and some other people who were opposed to the war, that was sort of the end of his career at MSNBC. And I asked Phil, when did that happen? And he says, well, it happened before the troops got into Baghdad. So they were going to get rid of him. But if there be more people like Phil Donahue, more people like Amy Goodman, and less people like Judith Miller and the New York Times, we might not be facing what we are right now in Iraq. And it's a pretty sad statement, but a pretty important one to understand, as Amy continually stresses, the role of media in this country, particularly now in the roll-up and the lead into the war. I want to do something a little different than I normally do at these kind of talks. Frequently I'll give, the rabble-rousing talk out on the streets and all that kind of stuff. But I want to tell a story about my recent trip to Germany. It took place 6 months ago or so, and I was there to do something really special that Amy referred to. After being utterly frustrated with the inquiries in this country, there's been a dozen so far, going on around torture, and what happened at Abu Ghraib, and what happened in Afghanistan, and what happened in Guantanamo, and the fact that you had as one side of the department, you had Rumsfeld as head of the military, one of the people who authorized the torture, and on the civil side you had Gonzales, the other guy who authorized the torture, and the Congress was completely stymied. We at the Center for Constitutional Rights decided to go forward and file a criminal complaint in Germany. Germany had, interestingly enough, the best single law on what we call universal jurisdiction. That means that if a person commits a war crime, that person can be brought to justice in Germany no matter where they're found. An amazing law, and particularly can be used when the host country, where the alleged criminals are from, is not doing anything about it. So I went to Berlin with a 200 or 300 page complaint with some other lawyers, and we filed this case in Germany. You can do that in Germany in a way that's very different than here. They have to actually look at the case. We filed the case, and as I said, against Rumsfeld, against Gonzales, against some of the people, the alleged torturers were actually living in Germany. General Sanchez was there. He was head of the Iraq war for a period. Pappas, who was head of the military intelligence brigade that did Abu Ghraib. So it gave us really a lot of handles in Germany. Important action, of course, not covered widely in Europe, all over the papers in Germany, covered here really by the person standing in the back of the room, Amy Goodman. So again, press and what you know about and what you read about is very, very restricted here. As I said, it met tremendous support in Germany, and they actually had a session for me at the Berlin Bar Association, which just shows the difference. You can imagine having a session for me at the American Bar Association here on this case. So I go into the Berlin Bar Association, which is in the old part of East Germany. Now, of course, one country. And there's a woman president, and she spoke, and she said, I'm going to tell you the story of the name of the Bar Association. And the Bar Association was called the Hans Litten Bar Association. And everybody wondered who that is, and she explained. Hans Litten was a prominent lawyer in the early 30s. He was only 29 years old when he tried one of his earliest cases representing some people who'd been murdered by the SS, which was not at that point an official state organ, but was really Hitler's stormtroopers, literally, but not in the government. And as one of his witnesses in 1931, Hans Litten called Adolf Hitler to the witness stand. And he did, Hitler was not in power, he did a 2-hour examination of Adolf Hitler, trying to bring out the fact that the Nazi Party was not a party that stood for legality, but was a party that was that stood for going beyond the law, doing things unlawfully, and going around the laws and doing anything they could to take power. A 2-hour examination became very prominent from that case in Germany. And then his clients, I think, got off in that case. They had been accused, of course, of doing the attack on the SS. And in later cases, he continued to represent people from progressive side, left side, communist side, through the early 30s. Hitler, though, never forgot what role Hans Litten played. And on the night of the Reichstag fire, late February 1933, Hans Litten was arrested. And arrested would be a word you might use if there was some charge, but in any case, he was taken into custody, not because he'd committed any crime, but because the SS at that point said, that's it, Hans Litten, we are taking you into what they called protective custody. He was taken in protective custody without charge, without trial, without sentence. As I said, they called it protective custody. And he was sent from camp to camp, from Spandau, eventually to Dachau. His mother was an upper-class woman. She knew everybody. She knew people in the Nazi Party. She tried to get her son out. They said, there are no legal steps you can take to get your son out. Her son was tortured by beatings. Eventually, he confessed to something. He took the confession back. They tried mock executions on him to get him to confess. Mail from his mother was held up. It was given to him if he talked, if he didn't talk. And by, 5 years later, 1939, Hans Litten commits suicide in prison, not being able to take it anymore, being told you're going to have to be an informant, being beaten all the time. When I heard this story, I was pretty amazed by it, and pretty amazed that here you have the East Germans and the West Germans both agreeing that this is the figure that they want to name their bar association about. I bought the book. It's called Beyond Tears, that his mother wrote. It came out in 1940, and it's absolutely chilling reading. And it's chilling not just for what the Nazis did then, but for where this country is going today. I just want to say a couple of statements from the book. One statement said, law became weaker and weaker as a guardian of justice. Judges lost standards of impartiality, and lawyers their standards of professional honor. Now, we can all fill in the blanks on that. We know I'll tell you about what's happened to the law. We can talk about what happened to the judges when Judge Roberts goes to the Supreme Court after negotiating for a Supreme Court judge while he's sitting on one of our key cases having to do with the legality of military commissions. At the same time, he's thinking of going up to the court. And you all know the role of lawyers within the administration. You know their names. You, Addington, who's just appointed to Libby's old job, Bybee, sitting on the Ninth Circuit, really the lawyers who are authors of the torture memos. Now, there's other lawyers, and that's where, of course, there's differences here. There's other lawyers we're working with on Guantanamo. There's 450 lawyers from all across the country, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, all across the board, helping us out. So it's not the same in the sense that Litten really couldn't get a defense attorney, but the tendency that you see from reading Hans Litten's story to what's going on today really what woke me up. And as Litten's mother said, as she struggled to free her son, she said, and I'm quoting, "I still imagined that we were living in a legal state, one in which you could go into a court and say, why are you holding my son?" But in fact, of course, as she later found out, that she was living in an outlaw state, a state in which law really was not relevant, that it was really what Hitler wanted. Hitler was the law. And I'm telling you this story not because I think we're living in the Germany of the 1930s, but to emphasize the dangers of the direction in which the Bush administration is taking us. In a number of respects, we are no longer living in a legal state, but in an outlaw state. And by that I mean the many legal constraints that we have on the executive, whether you call them what you learned in high school, checks and balances, or whether you call them the Convention Against Torture, or you call them the fact that a court is allowed to say you are not holding that person for a proper legal reason. A lot of those constraints on the executive are being ripped apart, ripped away, and the executive really is acting in many ways, particularly for certain populations, Muslims, non-immigrants, but citizens as well, is acting really as a king without any real checks and balances. And you all know, I think, the generalities, really, of the lawlessness of the country and of the Bush administration. You all know about the Iraq War, the violation of the UN Charter, the election and the craven role that judges played in making or anointing President Bush. You know about the International Criminal Court and our utter failure to comply with that treaty or wanting to even sign that treaty. And of course, Kyoto. You know those general terms. My area really of expertise that I'm most familiar with in the last 4 years since 9/11 is the area of detention and torture. So the Center for Constitutional Rights is representing the Guantanamo detainees. We're representing people who've been rendered to other countries for torture. A man named Mahar Arar, who was sent from an airport at Kennedy to Syria to be tortured. And we're representing people who were internally detained after 9/11. In these cases, the Bush administration has abandoned fundamental legal protections. If the state can arrest you and detain you and not let you challenge why they are holding you in any court and simply keep you locked up using the term enemy combatant without any justification or reason, you can really say that freedom is at an end, because that is really what's fundamental. What's fundamental is that you can't be grabbed by the neck, thrown into a prison, the key thrown away, and not go into a court. And I remember when I was studying the Magna Carta with my son when he was in high school, and we came across Article 39. Even though I'm a lawyer, I didn't really remember it. But that's the one that said, years 12-15, before you go to jail, you need a jury of your peers. And I sometimes say, well, the Bush administration, for them, the Magna Carta doesn't exist. And in 900 years, we've gone back to the year 1214. And I really believe that right now we are facing an incredible crisis in terms of the question of what some people call arbitrary detention, what I would call simply the government's claim that it can pick up any person anywhere in the world and imprison them. And today, if you listen to George Bush, there's no Geneva Conventions. That's dispensed with in terms of Guantanamo. There's no convention against torture that prohibits the United States from torturing or from using cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment against people. There's no due process, which gives you the right to be charged, a trial, and a sentence. And then, not only are there none of those, there are memos written by these lawyers saying that the president, in the name of national security, can carry out torture, that he is not bound by laws that are really fundamental to any civilization. The particulars of these laws are really horrendous. They're really blood-chilling. If I look at our clients on Guantanamo, and Guantanamo to me, Abu Ghraib is as well, but are iconic symbols of really what this administration is doing to human beings. Right now, 500-600 people in Guantanamo. They've been there 4 years, almost 4 years. My first client was picked up in January 2002 and taken to Guantanamo. His name is David Hicks. He is still sitting in Guantanamo. People picked up all over the world, no charges, simply put on an airplane after they're beaten, tortured, sent sometimes to another country for torture, taken down to this prison camp, and left there for 4 years with absolutely no due process and nothing on the horizon for getting them out. No charges, no trials, no sentences. And I said earlier, they're called enemy combatants. But that's just really a label that you should all get in your mind. Enemy combatants is simply a term that means you have no legal rights. No legal rights at all. So they're placed in a prison camp, no constitutional rights, and initially the government claimed no right to even go into a court. The case that Amy referred to, or that was referred to in the introduction, that the center won, was the case in which we went to the Supreme Court and we said, you can't do this. There's a thing called the writ of habeas corpus. That goes back really in origin to the Magna Carta. It gives you the right to go into the court, any human being, and say to the government, why are you holding me? Why am I here? And the Supreme Court said in a 6-3 decision that the people in Guantanamo actually have the right to go into a court and say to the government, why am I here? That was June 2004. We thought we were along the way at that point. The government has put up roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. We got into the court, the government admits, we're in the courthouse. It's a nice big room like this one. But unfortunately for your clients, there's no rights once you get in the courtroom. the courtroom is empty, and therefore we can hold you forever. No due process rights, no right against the convention, no rights against torture, no rights against anything. In fact, they even said, evidence we get from you by use of torture, we can use if and when we ever try you. Not only are they being held in that way, in that kind of way, without any kind of due process, but of course the interrogations amount to and are torture. And they were authorized at the highest level. This is not some rump little group of people who engaged in torture. There's a memo. Rumsfeld himself signed that memo authorizing a series of techniques that were used against our clients in Guantanamo. They say things like exploit phobias, and then it says e.g. dogs, stripping, hooding, stress positions, and in stress positions, after you're chained to the floor for 4 hours, Rumsfeld writes, how come only 4 hours? I stand for 10 hours a day. So this was a policy carried out at the highest levels of government. And now really, and it reminds me so much really in a way of the Haitians that I represented in Guantanamo. When I went down to Guantanamo for the Haitians, I said I never want to go back again. It was Dante's ninth circle of hell to me. It was one of the most horrendous, I mean, the heat, the scorpions, the mud, the bathrooms that didn't work, and these were refugees. So you can imagine how the government, the Bush administration, is treating alleged terrorists. And at one point, my Haitian clients went on a hunger strike. And I remember visiting them laid out in a field, being fed with intravenous when they got too sick to survive. And right now, as we're speaking, there's a hunger strike going on in Guantanamo. There's 200 and some people on a hunger strike. There's 20 or so who are being forced fed. The government, the Bush administration, calls it assisted feeding. Amy Goodman, again, has had a program around this, assisted feeding. But assisted feeding consists not of intravenous, but consists of a thick tube that is stuffed down your nose and into your stomach. And that's called assisted feeding. And presumably, because some of these people don't want to be assisted in their feeding, have ripped the tubes out. And I presume, we don't know, some of those people are chained down flat with their heads not able to move while that tube is being inserted into their noses. Now let's say, what are they asking for? They're not asking to be released. They're saying, we want to know why we are here. If we're guilty of something, charge us, try us, and sentence us. That is their fundamental demand. A lawyer who is working with us describes what the Bush administration calls assisted feeding. And it's done, as she says, in the presence of doctors. And here's what her client told her happened. They took the tube out of one detainee and with no sanitization or anesthetic, reinserted the tube into the nose of a different detainee. When this was done, the detainees could see the blood and the stomach bile from the other detainees remaining on the tube. This is happening today, right now, in Guantanamo. Now, again, like some of my Haitian clients, some people have resorted to suicide, attempted suicide, what the government prefers to call self-inflicted harm, or some euphemism so they don't have to call it suicide. Amy just had one of the lawyers on the program, one of our co-counsel on the program, who actually witnessed, the only one to witness an attempted suicide. And here's how he describes it. The lawyer visited Guantanamo a few weeks ago. His client was named Juma Dasari. He said to his lawyer, I have to visit the restroom. He went to the restroom under guard, but he didn't return. The lawyer knocked on the door of the restroom, calling out his client's name. When the lawyer didn't hear a response, he stepped inside and saw a 3-foot pool of blood on the floor. Numb, the lawyer looked up to see his client, Dasari, hanging unconscious from a noose tied to the ceiling. His eyes rolled back, his tongue and lips bulging, blood pouring from a gash in his right arm. There's really not much more to say about Guantanamo. I mean, there's a lot more to do about it, but that is what is going on right now. To say somehow that we think we are living in a legal state would just be utterly and flatly wrong. We are now living in an outlaw state. And while I wanted to bring up the parallel with Germany, yes, as I said, there are parallels, but of course, there are many differences that show, in my view, that we haven't yet completely gone to the dark side. We're at a tipping point We're at a point that's going to predict our futures and what our legal futures and what our futures are as free citizens. But we haven't gone there yet. As I said, there's been a legal response of hundreds of lawyers who get it. They understand that what's being taken away from people are fundamental rights. There's been a weak, independent judiciary, but we've at least won something from them. And the public debate is at least finally beginning on torture. We've seen the recent articles. There was one in the Times yesterday, an appalling one, of course, about Cheney and the administration wanting to continue using torture, cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment. There was one in the Washington Post about the CIA hellholes all over the world. There was a very good Frontline piece about torture. So the public debate is beginning. Now, I've painted for you, and in my last couple of minutes, I just want to say I've painted for you a fairly dark picture. But I'd like to also say there's a brighter side. I won't say brighter, but at least one with some level of optimism. Because in some ways, we are actually at a remarkable moment, certainly in the 4 post-9/11 years that we've been living through. The administration is in some sense really self-destructing right now. I wish the progressive movement could take credit for it. But it's really, I think, a self-destruction that has come more out of what you might call imperial hubris or its own belief that it was all-powerful. Unfortunately, the progressive movement has not pushed, has not been strong enough, and of course the Democrats have just been not there at all. So despite that, this administration seems to be undergoing, as I said, self-inflicted wounds and unraveling. We can just go to a few items which I'm sure some of you are quite familiar with. I'm sure a lot of you saw the David Brooks column in the Times. I never read David Brooks, conservative Times columnist, but he's having a lot of trouble now. After Katrina, he wrote a column called Bursting Point. In Bursting Point, he said, look, the country's sick of it. They're sick of Enron. They're sick of seeing the results of Katrina. They're sick of the war in Iraq. And the country is at a bursting point. And something is going to change. And he says it's like the 60s and the 70s. I lived through the 60s and 70s. I wish it were like that. But in any case, at least he's saying something is changing. And he says it could go in a couple directions. It could go in a progressive direction, or it can go in a right-wing Giuliani direction. And really, in some way, my message to you throughout this talk and as I end is really the direction that it takes is really going to be up to all of us in this room. I mean, that's where the progressive movement and progressive people and people who care about fundamental rights are going to be important. Because I think we are at a point, a tipping point, a breaking point, a bursting point, whatever you want to call it, where we can't really depend on the Democrats to do it, but it's going to take masses and masses of people. So even conservatives like Brooks are saying that. You saw, I think, Lawrence Wilkerson's speech, the aide to Powell, who, after he quit, gave this talk about essentially a cabal running Washington of Cheney and Rumsfeld, who got us into the war in Iraq, approved torture, and the like. And yes, it's a cabal, but it's a cabal that's unfortunately has a lot of media, or did have a lot of media support out there, and a certain grassroots support. But it does demonstrate, really, to me, that there is a break in that administration. And then, of course, you saw Krugman's column, I guess, this week, when he says, it's called The End of the Nightmare, and there's this great quote in there: the Bush administration will stagger on for 3 more years, but its essential fraudulence stands exposed. And then he talks about the nightmare we've been living through. And yeah, for me, for others, it's a nightmare, and it's an intellectual nightmare, it's a political nightmare. But for the people living it, it's not a nightmare, it's real. Iraq is real, Guantanamo is real, Abu Ghraib is real, and Afghanistan is real. As I said, if you look at other weaknesses, obviously Iraq, they're mired down in Iraq. And yes, you could say that's hurting them, but of course, and attacks have gone from 230 a week to 700 a week. But sadly, that miring down means the death of thousands and thousands of people. But again, where have the Democrats been on that issue? Where have our senators been on that issue? Not a word against the war. Not a word. And then, of course, the great joy, not as great a joy as I thought I would have. I thought they were going to indict at least 5 people, but they only indicted Scooter Libby so far. Perjury, obstruction of justice, and lying. You all know the story. It's the attempt to cover up the fact there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And of course, now how they responded to that story, it's a weakness, but Cheney has now appointed Addington as his as the substitute Libby. Addington you could call the station master for torture. He's the one whose hands are not all over the documents, but he's the one who helped direct what went on. And then, of course, another weakness is Katrina. It exposed for all of us the poverty in this country, the racism in this country. Again, crucial, but again, the administration trying to overcome it. And finally, there's the media exposure, which, as I've talked about, is really beginning to come out. The administration is weakness. Some of us would even say it's on the run. But in some way, when I was talking to Phil, in some way, it's like a cornered animal, though. And it's not like they're dead or they can't fight back, as they're doing with their latest Supreme Court nomination, or as they're going to continue to do. They are on an ideological straight ahead, and it's going to be for us to keep weakening them, keep them running, keep exposing their lies and deceptions. One thing you can do, and just has come up now, a big blow was the McCain Amendment. I don't know if you're familiar with it. 90-9, the Senate voted to ban cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. That includes most of the stuff I mentioned with Guantanamo. Some of that's torture, some of it's the lower level cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. 90-9. It's going into conference in the next few days. The president says he'll veto it, or he says they want to exempt the CIA. That should just horrify any human being, not any progressive, not just any Democrat, not just any Republican. That should horrify any human being. What they're saying is, yeah, we won't have our army do it anymore, our military, but we still want the CIA to engage in cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. There is a chance for you to get active on that issue. There's a vote going on in the House, possibly today or tomorrow, to say to the Senate Joint Conference, don't eliminate the prohibition on cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. Crucial. And let me tell you, the CIA people are terrified because these memos, this authorization of torture, this was done primarily for one reason, the memos. That was to protect the guys doing the torture. They said to the government, they said to Gonzales, we don't want to do this. We don't want to do this unless we have legal protection. McCain Amendment will take it away, and then maybe we'll get less. As I said, we're at a turning point. And I don't know if you all remember the book by J. Edgar Hoover, our former FBI director, who said No Left Turns was the name of his autobiography. Well, we're at a turning point, and our turning point ought to be only left turns. So my closing message to you is this is not a time to really sit on our hands. It's not a time to be, as was said, to be summer soldiers. It's a time to be winter soldiers and to really get out there and end torture, end Guantanamo, and really bring this administration down. Thank you.
Well, here I am, following the son my mother wanted to have. I wondered if you'd recognize me, and sure enough, a guy in the lobby said, "Hey, Merv." I recently was invited to attend the premiere of a film called After Innocence. I was very anxious to get there because I heard I was in it. And I was. It's the story of 7 or 8 people wrongly convicted, serving time for a crime they absolutely did not do. And of course, everybody patted them on the head and said, "Sure, pal, everybody in here says they're innocent." And on a particular day, they saw the Donahue show, some of them in this film, and saw Barry Scheck on the Donahue show, the lawyer and the DNA guy. And they wrote to our office, and thank God somebody in the office forwarded their mail, and they're free. And at the end of the film, all of these exonerees went up on the stage, And and I'm way in the back of this theater, and I hear my name. And so I am summoned to the stage, and I walk up on this stage, and I am embraced now by wives, children, mothers. People in the audience are standing ovation. People are crying. I felt like Elvis. And I have to say that what I did in that one show for 1 hour, Michael Ratner has done with his whole adult professional life. With a lot fewer hugs and very few moments of glory. It is hard to overstate the nobility of the work that he does. He is the velvet glove in the Constitution. God bless the framers, placed there to rise up and rescue a powerless, penniless, unpopular person from the tyranny of the majority. That is the fabulous feature of the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the American democratic experience. Alas, we look up now in the beginning of the 21st century to discover that the people who run our government, the Republicans who can't wait to extol the virtues of the framers, who give prizes to children who write the best essay, Why I'm Proud to Be an American, what the Constitution means to me, are essentially treating the Bill of Rights as a quaint idea. All men are created equal unless we're scared. All men are entitled to due process unless they're named Muhammad. Free speech is a wonderful idea, but it's not very practical. Certainly not now. And the American public is largely standing mute. While the Bill of Rights is being shredded, more and more young men and women are giving their lives to an immoral, unnecessary, unconstitutional, unwinnable war. And the American populace is standing largely mute. Professor Reinert of Princeton University has made the point in the New York Times in an op-ed piece that makes the case. This is a war for which the American people have not been asked to sacrifice. I don't know the math, but it may be as few as 5% of us have actually sent a loved one to this war. And for these brave people, proud Americans all, the sacrifice has been tremendous. Not only the injuries are more heinous, the hardships on those who have been called up 2 and 3 times is greater. Single mothers back trying to raise children and make it to the next paycheck are sacrifices and challenges that are greater, very possibly, than have been summoned from our citizenry in past wars. And the irony is that the Constitution could have saved us from this. If the warriors who couldn't wait to get to Baghdad had been as respectful of the Constitution as Michael Ratner, this never would have happened. Start with Article 1, Section 8. Only Congress can declare war. We haven't invoked that since the early 40s. It's much easier for a spineless Congress to ignore that mandate and essentially say, look, if you have to, Mr. President, if you have to, thereby covering their own butt. We're in Long Island. I want to make sure I'm reverent here. I'm from Connecticut, and I want you to respect me. Think about it now. The Iraq resolution allowed Congress to give the president the opportunity, if he wanted to go to war, and if the war didn't work, they were going to be able to say, well, I mean, we told them if. We didn't mean that. Everybody's covered. And now we're in the worst foreign policy debacle of my lifetime and heading toward the shoals of a Vietnam experience. And we have an administration that is insisting that we have to send more troops to Iraq because we've sent troops to Iraq who've been killed. So we're sending more people to get killed because we've sent people to get killed. And the Democratic leadership stood there like a deer in the headlights and allowed this to happen. Reminding me again that Ralph Nader was right. We're never going to fix anything as long as we only have two major parties. We're never going to get money out of politics. We're never going to, moneyed interests will be able to put all they've got on two horses and they're in a win-win situation. Imagine in the last two elections, the chairman of the two parties decided who got on the stage. What is usurpation of power to you? A presidential election is the people's business. And Frank Fahrenkopf, the leading lobbyist for the gaming industry, chairman of the Republican Party, and Paul Kirk, doing pretty well as a lobbyist. By the way, I don't think they should be executed for this kind of commerce and enterprise. Lobbying is legal. But they shouldn't be deciding who gets on the platform for the presidential debates. If you don't get on the debates, you're nowhere. No one will take you seriously. You can campaign in every city in this country and not reach the same number of people you reach on the debates. You can't win if you're not on. And businessmen are deciding who gets on. It's a show. It's a show that's sponsored. And should we wonder how it is that one president and 6 or 7 of his closest advisors can take us in to this horrible war experience that has isolated us from the rest of the world. We are bombing crowded cities at night where old people and children are sleeping. And if you suggest that America might have a responsibility for the mayhem that has ensued and the strengthening of the terrorist movement, you are immediately slapped down as a person who blames the victim. You cannot have a television show if you're anti-war, for example, unless you're funny. Bill Maher against the war. Jon Stewart is against the war. Don Imus is against the war. You can't be Bill Moyers. He's been muted at PBS. So here we are. It makes you wonder if we're a serious nation. Oppose this war, ba-dum-bump. you can have a show. A little bit of humor helps the reality go down. So it's up to us now, and if I believe we're the patriots. I believe Michael Ratner, Amy Goodman, and I honestly believe the assembly of these people of conscience here at Stony Brook are the patriots. We really believe in the Constitution. We want a separation of church and state. Don't tell us that America is anti-God. We're the most religious nation on earth. We throw more holy water, worship in more churches, synagogues, and mosques, are sent on our final deliverance with more rites and services and holy smoke. We sing in more choirs than any other nation in the history of civilization, and I say God bless us for it. The reason that religion, by the way, you put God on Time magazine and it flies off the shelf. Watch Time and Newsweek at Easter and Christmas. We are a very religious nation. No one is inhibiting our freedom to worship. The Christian right-wing fringe has conducted a crusade without a devil. They want the world to think they're beleaguered. Don't let them into your school. Keeping the crucifix out of the public school enhances the vitality of religion. It ensures that no public school teacher who talks to God every day and God talks back will fool with your child's mind. It ensures that a Jewish child will not wind up as a shepherd in a nativity play at Christmas time. Oh, divine Savior, thank you for coming into my life to redeem my sins. The framers were so smart. They knew what they were doing. We should celebrate their genius, their foresight, and keep it as it is. It's good for religion, and it's good for non-believers as well. Madeleine Murray O'Hara was my first guest. There's no God, there's no heaven, there's no hell. When you die, you go into the ground and the worms eat you and you biodegrade. And of course I said, we'll be back in just a moment. But I really liked her, you know. She was very unpleasant in many ways. I mean, she didn't suffer fools badly, she didn't suffer them at all. And she would say, I don't care how, you can worship a pet rock, but you pay for it. She was upset because she had to pay more taxes because churches got all these breaks, you know, tax breaks. You know, she made me think. And I'm a graduate of the University of Notre Dame, 16 years of Catholic education. When I was a kid, I just thought I was the best thing that anybody could possibly be, Irish and Catholic. I felt sorry for people who weren't Irish Catholic. We had a parade. We had the best music. It was lilting, lovely. Over in Killarney. Tooraluralura. And then in 1980, I married a Lebanese girl. And the music of my life changed. I started sleeping with the light on. Marlo's parents, when we were growing up, were children of the 50s. By the way, I could never figure out how could we possibly put 120,000 Japanese Americans behind a fence? I just couldn't, honestly. What? I understand it now. There's no confusion anymore. The terrorists, the men with beards and are the new and dark skin are the new yellow peril for America. It's amazing what you can do if you scare the people. When I was, Marlo says when she was in the 50s, her parents used to say if they didn't know what they were doing, they wouldn't be in Washington. We believed this. Eisenhower, the war, we defeated fascism. We stood up and sucked it in and challenged successfully after Pearl Harbor. Lend-Lease, we were generous and good in all things. We were the best you could be in everything. And it wasn't long, I don't know how many years later, I met Noam Chomsky. And I said, what are you trying to say? And he said, never, ever trust the state. That was, what? And I'm just such a slow learner. I see it now. I see what the framers meant. I see how important dissent is. I see that there is no democracy without dissent. None. And I realize that my responsibility to the fallen, to the brave young men and women who went and died on foreign lands to preserve my right to protest, shall not be wasted. I will not sacrifice their courage, nor will I waste their blood. They gave me this privilege, and I'm going to stand up, and I'm going to use it. I'm going to challenge the state. I'm going to speak up. There is nobody can call me any names that will come anywhere near the pain that has been fallen upon the families who've offered their own sons and daughters to the efforts, the military efforts that have been executed by this country down through the ages. I'm going to bring America, I'm going to make my small contribution to bring America home to this fabulous document called the United States Constitution. I'm going to stand with Michael Ratner, and I'm going to say, I cannot tolerate putting a person in a cage without papers, visitations, phone calls, proper diet, torture. We have over 25 deaths of prisoners that we've held in prison. And all the while, we have media, American corporate media, beating the biggest drum for this war. You couldn't possibly, occasionally you can get on as a guest, and then you're like the doll in the carnival. They throw things at you for the amusement of the audience. You can get on television as a guest, but you cannot have your own show. The entire progressive side of the political spectrum has been silenced in the freest land on earth. And it's a shame. These people have something to say. These people are patriots too. Liberal is the political idea that dare not speak its name. The people who run America's networks are terrified of being called liberal. Liberals are against war, they're wimps. Liberals are tax and spend. Liberals are for death, choice. Conservatives are for life. And the biggest coup de grace of all carried out by the billion-dollar hype machine of the Republican Party and the Christian right. Liberals don't have God. Conservatives have God. We don't have God. And millions of Americans are buying this, instead of being reverent to the First Amendment. And these self-righteous ones, I mean, they can't wait to God bless this, God bless that, God bless my dog, and God bless my cat. You can cut the piety and the pretense with a knife. God himself must be up there, wincing. All right, I hear you. Now talk to the person next to you on the bus instead of invoking me. They've taken Darwin out of biology textbooks. You know, if your kid doesn't get the scholarship of the man who's responsible for the greatest understanding of the origin of all life on Earth as we know it, 1859, Origin of Species, your child will never make a contribution to a vaccine, will never fix sickle cell, Tay-Sachs, or any of the blood diseases that strike randomly innocent, helpless children, will never be inspired to a life of science, will never win a Nobel Prize. But these people know what they're doing. They are essentially saying, if I was God, I wouldn't do it this way. And it's working. 51% of us do not believe in evolution. They are presiding over the dumbing of America, and the American populace is standing there mute. We are, most of us, not all, most of us born by accident of birth, born into the most fabulous experiment in Republican democracy in the history of civilization. And a significant number of the rest of us have worked to get here and swear allegiance. And we are living in a country with a Bill of Rights that said to those little Jehovah's Witness kids, you don't have to salute the flag. Little kids hung onto his britches because he was raised Jehovah's with his parents. 5th grade, Minersville, Pennsylvania, 40s. The war is looming. Wouldn't salute the flag, little bastard. Imagine, they were scum. We threw stones at those kids. And finally, after 2 decisions, the Supreme Court comes down from on high. And all these old white guys looked over that mahogany bench and they said to those children, you obey your parents. Justice Robert Jackson. If there is any fixed star in the constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in religion, nationalism, politics, or any other matters of opinion, nor may he force to confess by word or deed a belief therein. You can't force an American to believe anything. You can't force an American to believe in America. You can't force an American to believe in the United States itself, the United States Constitution. That's how secure we are. That's a wonderful one. That gives me goosebumps. That makes me a proud American. And we've got to get back there. We've got to get back to a faithful people who, in their freedom to worship, choose a faith that comes from their own heart, is richer, more personal, more beautifully arrived at, rather than to be pressured by the political monsignori tripping over their robes and God blessing everybody. We've got to get back to the realization that criticizing America is patriotic. And we've got to certainly get back to never, ever trusting the state. I'm very pleased to have been your guest here at Stony Brook. And I hope to come back soon. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. Well, that was life compliment. It was good. You were great. You got to teach me how to speak one day. You're great.
Thanks very much. I do think we have time for questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, there are 2 microphones at the front. So would somebody like to come forward?
25.
Hi. Thank you both. That was terrific. Will I live long enough to see the one party, the corporate party system, change fundamentally and hopefully in a better direction? Will my son, who's 22, see this?
You raised it, Phil.
We have 2 parties because we have 2 parties. We'll have 2 parties tomorrow because we had 2 parties yesterday. Millions and millions of Americans have grown up with 2 parties are an extension of our Constitution. It's just the way our system works. Don't argue with me. And as long as the 2 parties can determine how many signatures it takes to get on the ballot, for example, or who gets on the, I still can't tell you how outrageous is that usurpation of the people's power. That is to say, remember the League of Women Voters used to have the debates. Now it's big business. Big business produces a show, and the show is called the presidential debates. It would be misleading of me to tell you that I suggest to you that I know when this will happen. But I think it will be one of the great, and runoff voting, by the way. We should listen to John Anderson and runoff voting. A very good idea. Disallowing someone from paralyzing. You know, it's wrong. It's wrong that, one person should be able to deprive another person with leading votes of the victorious office that would be otherwise going to him. But I have no idea when this will happen.
I wonder if the 2 of you could help me out and explain something. What you've had to say, not that it's something I haven't heard before, has been incredibly upsetting. Almost as upsetting is walking in here on the grounds of a major university. We're not in a large auditorium. A small portion of the faculty here could fill up this auditorium. 2 well-known speakers at a time when horrible things are happening. It's a question of whether we're losing our humanity. And I would guess that most of the people here are from the community. And maybe you can explain to me how it is that this place isn't just overfilled with students, faculty. Is there a problem with our educational system? What's happening? What's going on?
Asking these sort of difficult questions, but I mean, on one level, I answer that partly by saying we don't really have a grassroots people's movement in this country right now. When I was growing up in the 60s or 70s, we had SDS. Why that hasn't emerged, why we don't have that, I can't say. But without that happening, I think it's going to be very difficult. I think the media control has changed and shifted, and that's the second reason. And obviously, during the 60s and 70s, we had a draft. So that made people much more conscious of that. I was at a rally yesterday, the one in Union Square, and it was hard. It was actually good to see. Even my son walked out of his high school. So there was a high school walkout. There were thousands of young people sitting at this rally with slogans and saying, "Drive Bush out." So that made me feel good, but I actually think there's maybe more activity in high schools than there is in colleges. And I'd be interested in what some of the college people who teach at these places would say to that, and I don't know what Phil's answer.
Well, just one brief story. In 1985, I was in Moscow with my pal, Vladimir Posner. We did the space bridges, and we took the Donahue show to Moscow. In 1985, Gorbachev, actually early 86. Gorbachev came to power in April of 85. We went to Moscow in February of 86. And I was surrounded by 300 Muscovites, everybody with a headset, simultaneous translation, and I said to these people, and remember, this is 86, nobody's going anywhere yet. And I said, if you could go to the United States, where would you like to visit? And hands went up all over the place. I ran over, you know, this was simultaneous translation, and a guy stood up and he said, Las Vegas. And I went to another person, and the person said, Disney World. And finally I get to the back row, and a woman stood up and she said, Oxford, Mississippi. And I said, why? And she said, William Faulkner. And in my ear I heard, because that is the home of your great author, William Faulkner. And I wondered how many Americans knew that. We are a nation without curiosity for anything beyond our shores. The Soviet people at that time were much more interested in us than we were in them. The show in Russia that we aired, I mean, Vladimir got 86,000 letters. We barely got 26 cities in America to carry the show. Yeah, talking heads. So we are a nation that appears to have an ADD problem and to be dazzled by multimedia. And, you know, I spent my life competing with Monty Hall, who was always giving away $5,000 to a woman dressed like a chicken salad sandwich. It's tough out there, and we're not dressed like a chicken salad sandwich. So, you know, maybe if we get a Pekingese that speaks Chinese, the next time we'll get a bigger haul.
You know, one other thing that Phil suggested, which is when he said 5% of American families have sent people to Iraq, and I suggested with the draft that in some way although Iraq is obviously growing in people's consciousness, that they can sustain a certain number of deaths in this country and a certain expenditure without actually worrying about it, as long as it's not us. And when I think about us, and when I think about that with torture or Guantanamo, and I think most people, when I address them, well, it's not going to happen to me. Those are, you know, Muslim non-citizens picked up in Afghanistan or Zambia or wherever, and it's out of their consciousness. And so in some way, it's sort of the creation of the other. It's not going to happen to us. And it's also what Phil mentioned, I think, fear. I think people, as long as there's this great fear, people are willing to say, let the government do it, I'm not going to worry about it, you know, et cetera.
Hello, my name is Rosemary Schumann, and I think the audience is small because you've been preaching to the choir. But I want to tell you, I'm still a newspaper reader, and I've lost my naivete about the New York Times, and it was before the Judith Miller episode. It was after the first debate, and I was online. I'm learning now to use a computer. And a guy who works for NASA had extra days available to him, and he enhanced the picture of the bulge on Bush's back. Yes. And I saw a sequence of photographs. His job was to enhance pictures from Mars, but he did Bush's back. And it was a T-shaped object with like little round protrusions on the vertical part, and there was a wire going to his right shoulder. And I found out that he called an investigative reporter from the New York Times, told him about it, and the guy vetted it thoroughly. It was shortly before the election, which is a Tuesday, and the decision came through from the powers that be that it was too close to the election to print that in the paper. Now, I knew anybody who knew it would throw the election. I've been a teacher. You don't cheat on tests like that and get away with it, hopefully. But my question is, do the powers that control the Times, Salisbury, who's the publisher, I've read now that nothing happens there, that he doesn't okay. I want to know what you, in your position, with your perspective, would have to say on why the New York Times, who had editorials, they voted for, they wanted Kerry, but they wouldn't print this before the election.
Well, I think the best answer, the most flattering answer for the Times would be that the Times suits in the air-conditioned offices felt that they couldn't nail down the exact truthfulness of this image.
It was vetted. It was thoroughly vetted.
I will answer your question with just one very brief. Michael Moore never appeared on Meet the Press or Face the Nation. He did appear on George Stephanopoulos, but he was taped and edited, very edited. I think that's Karl Rove. I think this is, remember, these are programs that rely on access. That is the coin of the realm within the media in Washington. It's not for nothing you see all those reporters chasing the newsmakers. Access is critical. If you don't get Condi, nobody's going to take your program seriously. If you don't get Rummy, you've got to get these people. You've got to get Cheney. And then, lo and behold, if you're lucky, you get the biggest prize of all, the president himself. But as we're learning with this investigation of the Valerie Plame situation, Libby called Russert to complain about somebody saying something negative. And Russert immediately called Bob Wright, the chairman of NBC. So, Libby to Russert to Wright, boom! That's how short the leash is between the White House and media. And don't underestimate the importance of access. If I can't get these biggies on my show, nobody's going to take me seriously. I won't get ratings. I won't be respected. And so any threat at all, and also the White House, Michael Moore was booked on Larry King, and the White House refused to send a balancer to Michael Moore. And Larry King canceled Michael Moore. So by failing to send someone, you can control the media. It is unbelievable. Was it the ball cap? Is it because he's a little heavier than we wish he were? And by the way, criticize him. Tell him Fahrenheit 9/11 is a horrible lie. Do whatever you want. But Fahrenheit 9/11 was at the center of the presidential campaign. People lined around theaters around the world to see this film. But he was anathema to the White House. He may have been the #1 enemy on the enemy's list. Michael Moore you cannot overstate the hatred. I guess he's got a bodyguard. I mean, that's how bad it is. We have become a tribal nation. Red states and blue states. My goodness, what is happening to us? We're under the same flag. These people are dying for all of us. And by the way, before I forget it, there are two things that have doubled in the last month. The number of dead Americans in uniform in Iraq from 1,000 to over 2,000. And the other thing that has doubled is the price of Halliburton stock. It's gone from $33 to $66. What is war profiteering to you? And the American public is standing there mute.
Gentlemen, my name is Alan Lichtenstein. I would like to thank both of you for a very articulate and stimulating discussion and for reminding us that while you are speaking to the choir, reminding us that the choir has to sing to the audience. and that perhaps that's our responsibility to come away with today. But, Mr. Donahue, you asked how could this happen, and then you proceeded to partially answer your question when you dealt with the media. Many of us have come to the same conclusion, and we lay the seeds for that in the removal of the doctrine of equal time and its replacement by fair and balanced. What, in your opinion, both of you gentlemen, can we do to bring back the doctrine of equal time and remove the rise of right-wing radio, which goes unchallenged and provided the basis for the recent election results that caused the American public, the audience, so to speak, to, in their ignorance, vote for these ideologues, these whatever they are, these criminals, if you would like. What can we do to bring back, so to speak, the doctrine of equal time?
Where's Amy? Amy ought to address this question. Where is she? Amy, you're back there hiding?
You know, we can hear you there, Amy, if you don't want to run up here.
This is like, Amy.
So you'll stand so we can see you.
I think that this is a bigger question than even an issue of law. It's a question of taking back the media. They are using the public airwaves. Everyone, it's not just public radio and television like us. It is all of the networks, NBC, ABC, CBS. And they have an obligation to do what the Roundtable does at Stony Brook, to open the discussion to every different view. And that ultimately is really not even up to the executives of these corporations that run the networks. They don't own them, right? They lease them. They are a national treasure. They're the public airwaves. Ultimately, like the people who are in office today, that is decided by you. You decide whether those airwaves will be opened up. These networks have licenses that can be revoked if they are not fair. And I think that we are at a critical time, not only in the politics of this country, but when it comes to the media. They should be as focused on by organizations and people who care about democracy as any other institution, because the media are the most powerful institutions on earth. If people heard what Michael was describing today, what is being done in our name, they hear the graphic stories of what happened to Maher Arar, the Canadian who got sent by the American government to Syria and was tortured. If they heard those stories of what's happening to people at Guantanamo, and if they heard what happened to Phil, I mean, at MSNBC, I think people would do something about it. Unfortunately, they learn through the media. That is how, as Noam Chomsky says, consent is manufactured. But ultimately, there is a growing media democracy movement in this country. And that is exhilarating. Thousands and thousands of people turned out in St. Louis a few months ago to say, these are our airwaves. How do we protect them? Ask Michael Powell, son of Colin Powell, who helped to lead the war in Iraq. His son was the head of the FCC. He learned a very serious lesson when he tried to even further consolidate the media. Millions of people called Congress, wrote to the FCC, and said, no, this is dangerous to democracy. When media moguls, very few of them own the radio, TV, and newspaper in a town. That's people taking back the national treasure of the public airwaves. It's a growing movement in this country, and it's a very important one. I think that's where the kinds of questions you have should be asked and should fuel people here in deciding where to focus their energy.
Yes. Nice going. Well done.
Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Maura Campbell. I wanted to know if, how did you support of troops going into Afghanistan after 9/11?
What? Supporting the troops going into Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
No, I did not. I was on the air saying I do not think the most powerful nation on earth should be dropping bombs on people who live in caves. And I was thunderously criticized. I certainly wanted to go after Al-Qaeda like everyone else. We bombed a wedding party in Afghanistan. But now the bombing of Afghanistan is considered by some of the most profoundly progressive liberal people that I know as justified. I think going to Afghanistan was justified. But there is no such thing as precision bombing. If you bomb my house and incinerate my children, there's three things I can do. One, I can join peace movements and travel around the world speaking out in the memory of my family for peace. Or I can drink, get depressed, and die of liver disease. But there's a third thing I can do, and that is I can spend the rest of my life looking for you. And when I find you, I will put a stake in your heart, and I will smile as you die a slow and painful death. That is called terrorism.
I as well was against the war with Afghanistan. The center took the position that it was a wrong war, that it shouldn't have been fought, that the attacks on 9/11 against people in the United States were crimes against humanity, that there should have been police actions done with the United Nations. It should not have been a war against the country. And I think we see what the kind of thinking that led to the war against Afghanistan led to when you can start associating wars and bombing of countries with Al-Qaeda and the attack on the trade towers, because that's what then led into Iraq. And so I think it's a very, very dangerous thing we did in Afghanistan, and I think we're paying the cost of it now.
You mentioned before the muting of America with regard to people being dissatisfied with what's going on. I think current polls show that the majority of Americans don't approve of the way the war in Iraq is being handled. I think the number's around 45 or so actually approve. So that being the case, I was wondering, in your opinion, what is missing to ignite, to unmute the majority of America?
I like the figures, and I've actually used those figures when we talk about impeachment. The actual poll said that if Bush was lying about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, a majority of Americans think he ought to be impeached, which is pretty good. And I think it goes to Phil's point about democracy, that when you have democracy, it's based on this idea that people and your representatives decide based on what the true facts are, and not debating fictions. And so in that sense, the war in Iraq represents, in many ways to me, the end of democracy, because it really wasn't based on the consent of the people in any real way. The question of igniting it, I mean, you know, again, we're faced with at least two kinds of things, and people can answer this. One is we're faced with Democrats who just have not moved off the dime. And the question is, what do we do about that? All the appeals we're making, they aren't doing it. They're weak-kneed. You know, they're probably not even going to filibuster the latest nomination to the Supreme Court. You know, it's absolutely appalling. And how do you bring up people so that the Democrats feel the heat of someone running against Hillary and saying, if you don't oppose this war, I'm going to make this an issue? I mean, that's at least one thing. But I can only go back to what I said earlier. There has to be organizing around this country in every university, in every high school, in every kind of club, in every kind of organization, saying we have to be opposing this, because the Democrats aren't going to listen unless they hear it from their base.
I think Bob Shrum and all the inside baseball people sat Kerry down after he got the nomination, and they said, don't mess with this war. And you know what? I think these people may have been right. I am not at all convinced that an anti-war Democratic majority candidate would have beaten Bush in '04? The answer lies not in the stars, but in ourselves. It was the considered wisdom of the people who manage campaigns, fund campaigns, raise money for campaigns, write speeches, that you had to support this war. War is Trump. If you criticize the war before the war happens, you're not a proud American. If you criticize the war after it happens, you don't support the troops. If you criticize the war after the first soldier goes down, you defile his grave and his sacrifice. It is a hugely powerful pressure on people, just all people who hold political office, but take the 535 people on the Hill. By the way, 146, I'm not sure this exact number, members of the House voted no. And the vote in the Senate was 77 to 23. 23 senators voted no. We should be building statues to these people, including Lincoln Chafee, the lone Republican from Rhode Island. No on the Iraq War resolution, along with Jeffords. And then you had Kennedy, Leahy, Boxer, Bingaman. I can almost name them all. Stabenow, Levin, Dayton. There were 23 members of the Senate that said no. Wellstone, may he rest, said no. So, you know, we're alive. We just need to get some patriots behind candidates like this who are able to look this lion in the jaw and say, I'm not sending, with this kind of huffing and puffing, before an election day, I'm not going to respond to a president's call for me to send our precious blood, youngest and finest, to war when we don't even know whether the CIA has the story right.
I think we should just have 2 more questions, and then we can have this lovely reception that's waiting for us.
Mr. Donahue and Ratner, my name is Harry Allen. Thank you very much for your ideas. I'd like to express an opinion and ask you a question. Crises tend to exacerbate the fault lines or flaws in a culture. And I've not heard this said, but in my thinking, the ability to go to war against Iraq was in part predicated on the failure of this nation to fully grapple with the issue of race, and was itself a massive act of racial profiling. And what I mean by that is that after 9/11, it was very easy to tell Americans who thought of people of color a certain way that these people of color are just like those people of color, and we should go against those people of color and kill them. And for people not to say, well, those are different people of color than those people of color. To many Americans, they all looked alike. In fact, many of us heard of instances here in this country where people who looked to many Americans like Middle Easterners, but were in fact Sikhs or Indians, were brutally killed because they were blamed by hostile mobs for the flaws of 9/11. So I've not heard this said, but I think an examination of Iraq as a case of national racial profiling, as that term is commonly used, is in order. And that as long as this nation fails to grapple with race and to eliminate the problem of race, that frightening and spooky incidences like these are going to continue to haunt our present and our future. That's my opinion. The question I'd like to ask you is democracy scalable? And by scalable, I mean, does it work as the framers intended, whether one has 1,000 people or 100 billion? Does it work as it's outlined in the Constitution, regardless of the size of the population? And of course, the founders could not have anticipated this rampant technocratic mediocrity that we have, this government by media that we now possess. So does democracy work when you have 300 million people, which they didn't foresee, no slaves, and the media, electronic media that's instant and very corporate?
Let's talk about the opinion first. One of the things when I was referring to people in this country not caring about Guantanamo, that I was really talking about was essentially what you're saying about racial profiling, that the ability of the media and the government to paint Muslims, particularly non-citizens, particularly from certain countries, as the other and as people who can be either experimented on or expendable, is certainly true in this country, although I've never thought about it in those terms in thinking about Iraq. And it's worth thinking about, and worth thinking about if that would have been a white Western country, if the same thing would have happened. It's certainly true here in the United States in terms of, after 9/11, the thousands of people who were rounded up, the people who still are afraid to walk out of their homes if they're non-citizen Muslims, the fact they still can't go to demonstrations and rallies, the fact they still get beaten up. So that, I think, is the case. I think it's conscious. I think the media has painted it. I think the government has painted it. As to the broader question, I'm going to leave that to our Democrat here.
I think diverse media certainly argues for the very real possibility of successfully having a democracy. A diverse media, which is not what we have today. I have the dish. I have 600 cable channels, but 500 of them are selling the Bowflex machine. And also, I used to be a reporter in Adrian, Michigan. My first job as a reporter. It was fabulous. I had a microphone that's got the WABJ, call letters on it. Radio, 200 watt, 50 watt, the proverbial 50 watt. And I could stop the mayor like that. I was like 23 years old. I probably looked 13. I couldn't believe how much power I had. That radio station today is a computer. Clear channel. It's a reverse ATM machine. The music is pureed at another location and fed in. There's no high school football scores. There's no news. So I could have, at age 23, I was a reporter. I didn't pee in a bottle. I didn't pass a test. I said, I'm a reporter. And I was. That's the way you want it. If you have a lot of reporters, whole bunch of reporters, it's more likely that in the middle of this large crowd will be found the truth. The problem today is the middle is now occupied by fewer and fewer media companies, larger and larger in size, much more concerned about the price of their stock and not upsetting customers like liberals do than they are with sticking their nose under the tent and doing the inelegant work of finding out what the righteous leaders of ours are planning for us. That's the agony, and that's why Amy Goodman, it truly is the #1 person out there. She's got the biggest banner. Amy Goodman is a hit in the sense of how we measure value in our business. She's a hit. She has lots of people listening to her, and she has lots of stations carrying her program, and she is beholden to nobody. Holy cow, there is no overstating the value of that position that she holds in the general broadcast kingdom in America. In the words of the commercial, it's priceless.
Hi, thank you for coming. Yesterday I was watching the news and I was watching the memorial to Rosa Parks, and everyone got up and they said beautiful things about her life. And the one thing that stood in my mind was that this was a woman who took that one chance to make a statement. And what I would say to you is, you've used the word grassroots and movements and progressive movements throughout the country, is that not less than a mile from here, for the past 3 years, a group of people have been on a street corner with the North Country Peace Group protesting the actions of our government. We've been there in rain, snow, sleet, everything, many times having obscenities shouted at us. And I say this to you to know that we are out there, and to the others here today, to please join us. Let your voices be heard. Make this one defining moment in your life now, the Rosa Parks moment, where maybe you won't get up to speak, or you won't get on a TV show, as you had your defining moment with that 1-hour special with the people who were exonerated, and you who have spent your whole life doing the same things, that I would hope that the people in this room, just that 1 hour on Saturday mornings from 11 to 12, come out to 25A and join us. And lastly, my question is, if you had an opportunity to confront your senators about why they voted the way they did in the war, a Senator Clinton or a Senator Schumer, and you had the same opportunity face to face, I want to know the question that you would ask them.
You know, this is not the time for scolding. We had the largest number of deaths in Iraq in 1 month in October since the war began. You know, and I can't look at Senator Clinton and say, why did you do this? I understand why she did it. She did it because she felt that to vote otherwise would jeopardize her with her voting constituency. Patrick Kennedy of Rhode Island voted for the war. His father, Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, in the Senate, voted against the war. The question now is how long are we going to stand here with kids coming home with their arms and legs blown off, blinded, imagine, blind for life at age 22, 23. This president swaggered us into this war. We allowed him to do it. We have not been reverent to the Constitution. And the near lone voice in the Senate who stood up to speak for the Constitution and rail against the Iraq resolution was Robert Byrd of West Virginia. Elected to the Senate 8 times. Think about that. 6-year terms, 8, and he's running for re-election. We should know who voted yes, and we should know who voted no. And I do wish we could get people like Senator Clinton, Senator Schumer, to step forward. By the way, Corzine voted no. To step forward and say they're sorry they did. We're looking for a little of that now. I think it would help them. It would be cleansing. Jesus is the most important person in my president's life, and I believe him. I don't challenge his sincerity. When he closes his eyes, you know, I believe it. I believe he's praying. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Jesus calls him to look at the chaos and to appreciate his humanness and his finite, his capacity for error, and to be the brave Christian man we know him to be, and to acknowledge the error, and to say he's sorry, and to begin to heal the rift between the United States and the Islamic world.
Well, I'm not sure I would treat Hillary as nicely as Phil would. I mean, there were millions of people in the streets in the United States and all over the world. For some reason, my office and I wrote a book against the war with Iraq that put to rest any idea that there were weapons of mass destruction. So she obviously, I mean, I agree with him that she didn't vote because she didn't know better. I mean, she knew better. She probably knew there weren't any real threats. She knew probably in terms of her New York constituency she wasn't going to lose an election because of that. But she's thinking about being president. And in this country, I guess the safer bet is to go to war. And that's probably Phil's right on that. But I would yell my head off at her. So there you go.
Well,
saying
Because of people who didn't contact her. In other words, she didn't get enough opposition, is what she said.
Against. Yes.
Interesting.
I think we're going to have to stop now because I know our speakers need to get back to where they're going, but I think we should thank them very much for coming.
We got a problem in our country, Phil.
Well, we were doom and gloom over. What? We were doom and gloom.
What else are we going to do?
We're asking you.